Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our series on intro syntax. Today, we're going to do something a little different, and I'm going to talk about moving towards minimalist syntax. The model we've been building is largely couched in a framework known as government and binding, though it doesn't have all of the sort of uh, features of that model. It does incorporate a number of features of what we would call a minimalist model as well. So it's sort of a hybrid between a GB model and a minimalist model. But It does have some really key features of what we would associate with a more sort of traditional government and binding model of syntax. So what I want to talk about today are some of the more key features of a more modern minimalist syntax. This is going to be, again, just a basic introduction. We're not going to get into all the details, all the controversies, certainly not all the technical aspects. And I also want to just emphasize the fact that minimalism has been around now. The sort of first key paper in this was a minimalist program written by Chomsky, and that came out in 1993. I'm presenting this video in 2020. So we are talking about a span of now 27 years. The main sort of foundational work, the Minimalist Program, which is a volume which has a really critical chapter called Chapter 4. Early Minimalism is sometimes referred to as Chapter 4 Minimalism. That came out in 1995, and the 20th anniversary edition came out 5 years ago. So minimalism itself covers a broad range of analyses, a broad range of revisions to different ideas, theories, and so forth. So there isn't one version of minimalist syntax, and that's also something that's really important to keep in mind. I just want to cover some of the foundational ideas of minimalism and how they diverge from the some of the things that we've been talking about so far. I also want to emphasize a few sort of key sort of scientific points. The first is that a sort of, and linguists are not necessarily good at maintaining this distinction. In fact, most scientists aren't good at this. But there is sort of a boundary between what we would refer to as a theory, a boundary between what we would refer to as a framework, and a boundary between what we would refer to as a program. And minimalism writ large is really fundamentally a program. The idea behind minimalism is that we are trying to explore syntax with a particular mindset, and then the particular assumptions about the theoretic assumptions that we give are less critical. And that's fundamentally what makes it a program. It's about the sort of guiding principles that underlie our assumptions. A framework is something that outlines our assumptions, our sort of core theoretic assumptions that then guides our theory building. Government and binding theory was really a framework. So you can see that sort of mismatch of term and terminology and nomenclature there. That's the word I'm looking for. And then finally, a theory is a empirically sort of documented set of foundations, of assumptions. So what is minimalism? Well, at its core, minimalism is an idea that language is minimal. That the core aspects of language are actually not that major in our sort of cognitive systems. That really there is just a core kernel that we would call language, and that the rest of what language does is parasitic on or piggybacks on other cognitive systems. But there is this core kernel that is really what we would refer to as language. In a lot of Chomsky's work, he refers to what's known as, we can look at this in, there's a famous paper, it's either Chomsky-Hauser-Fitch or Hauser-Chomsky-Fitch, I forget the exact authorship. It refers to what's known as the faculty of language narrow, the faculty of language broad, and then other sort of systems outside of that are still required for us to have language. But these are sort of the core aspects of what it means to be a linguistic creature. And so really it's this, what linguists are studying is sort of the interaction between these two elements, what is inside the faculty of language narrow and what is inside the faculty of language broad, and how do they interact. And the idea behind what we see in most minimalist syntax is what are the relationships between these two elements. So for Chomsky, and most of his work, the core element of faculty of language narrow is faculty of language narrow contains one core process. He sometimes refers to this as recursion or merge. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. The faculty of language broad is our wider set of systems that are required for language. So our sensory motor system. So if we were speaking a spoken language, the sort of motor anatomy associated with that, and the auditory processing system that allows us to understand that language. If we're speaking a sign language, then the motor anatomy that allows us to sign that language, and the visual system that allows us to process that language. And that falls within the part of the faculty of language broad. And also our cognitive conceptual system, our intentional system, so our meaning system, our idea, the fact that we have, we know things, we interpret the world, these types of things. This relates to our language, but isn't a core part of our language in this system. So this is, and again, it's these two systems are going to interact with each other. And then on the outskirts, we have other aspects. So our pulmonary system, our digestive system, our circulatory system. These are necessary. If your heart's not beating, you're no longer a linguistic creature. If you're not breathing, you're no longer able to produce air. Well, one, you're probably dead. But two, you're also, you can't speak a spoken language if you can't produce air. But these are really external to what we would call language in any core sense. You need to digest food to be able to live. But that doesn't really make it part of the linguistic system. So the key differences between the core difference between the model we've built and the model that is presented in a sort of a basic model of minimalism stems in what we call the T model, and then a new model we're going to present, which looks very similar but has some key differences. So if we recall our T model, it has a deep structure, it has a surface structure, it has a relationship to what we call our phonetic or phonological form and our logical form. So here in our model, our deep structure is where we get our theta roles and our XBAR structures are computed. Here we get, this is where the syntactic structure is sort of, we apply syntactic rules, then syntactic structure is sort of sent off into these two different elements. And that's sort of the core elements. One thing that we haven't necessarily talked about is that, and it hasn't been particularly relevant for us, but we can call each of these different pieces levels of representation. That the syntax is represented at different levels, and different rules, different processes are checked at different pieces. So, for instance, at deep structure, theta for our model, theta roles are checked. That's where we make sure all of our theta roles are checked. At surface structure, it seems to be that case is checked, at least for everything we've seen so far. At LF, we seem to make sure that quantifier scope is appropriately checked and so forth. So that seemed to be how the model worked. For one of the key things that Chomsky did was he said, well, maybe this is too much. Maybe we can simplify our assumptions. We have a lot of different representations here. If we just assume that language is just sort of this combinatorial system, which takes one element and grabs another element and combines them together. Let's call that merge. And that merge process is going to give us, this core property of language that we call recursion. So we do these two things together. Maybe we can eliminate these different, some of these different representations. We know we need to have relationships between our sensory motor systems. So we know we need to have a relationship between our cognitive system, so our conceptual intentional system. Well, that's very similar to what we talk about with LF, and we know we need to have a relationship with our sensory motor system. That's very similar to what we talk about with PF. So what Chomsky basically said was we can modify this model. And this changes from the T model to the Y model. And it has a lot of similarities here. And, it looks almost identical, you might say. But the key differences, and there are some key differences, is there's not a level of representation up here. So in our deep structure, we fully build our tree structure. We're not going to do that we don't do that anymore in minimalism. And then here we have a process known as spell out. And spell out is not a new level of representation. It's just a point where the derivations break apart. And PF is really our surface structure. PF is what is sent to the sensory motor system. That is what is pronounced. LF is what is sent to the conceptual intentional system. That is what is interpreted. So there's no surface structure representation that is sort of there and present and can have things computed against it. And that's also a critical point. The other critical point is when we think about our XBAR schemas and things like that, those don't exist in the same way. Chomsky and other researchers like Spies and Fukuya worked on this idea that a more sort of minimalist approach is to say, well, when we're combining elements, we don't need to have these unnecessary combinations of intermediate structures when they're not present. We don't have bar levels when bar levels don't exist. And so the way the computation works now in this minimalist approach is we take two elements and we stick them together. then that forms a new complex object. We take another element, we combine that with that new element. And we build slowly up the tree. It starts here and it moves down. At some point, the derivation says, I'm ready to be sent to spell out. I'm ready to be broken apart. And that gives us these two different notions. Most of the fundamentals that we've done so far work very well with this. It will start to become more complicated. We can start thinking about different things. But the core assumptions that we've built so far work very nicely. Rather than having a deep structure up here, we have what's known as enumeration. And the enumeration is just a unordered set of the lexical items we're going to use to build our sentence with the associated features and so forth. So, silicum, lakes, foo-foo. So that would be our there would be a T in there. Sorry. And a voice and all of that. There's a bunch of other stuff in there. I'm not going to walk us through this full derivation. I can do that in a future video. But, to start I'll just start the derivation here. Well, really, so we would have something like a noun, foo-foo, which would probably project straight to an NP. Arguably, this could either project to a DP or not. We could worry about that, so we could have a D0 here. These two would combine together. And again, this is through a process of merge. They're just combining via they're just combining via by taking one element and combining it with another. Null elements still exist and so forth. Whether or not this vacuous projection exists is kind of an open question as well. But then we would merge this with our verb. So our verb would come in. And the critical thing is that the derivation starts low and moves up. So this would merge because there's nothing else within this. Just merge directly into a VP. We would get likes here. Voice would come in and so forth. But we would just move up the derivation like that. And so that's sort of the critical idea behind merge, is just you take two elements, it's still binary, and combine it together. A lot of other work has been spent on kind of building what merge does and what it is. Some folks seem to suggest that merge is associated with our ability to do mathematics and so forth. So that this sort of core property of language really is a core cognitive property and kind of defines what it means to be human. So with that, I know, jumping into minimalism is a little bit of a challenge. And I was probably clear as mud in this video. So I can try to clarify a little bit more going forward. But I wanted to give you the tools to look at some more modern approaches as well. Because the model we built is not a consistent model with any particular framework out there. So with that, I will stop the video. I do want to close with a quote as usual. I'm going with Seneca this time. It's a short one. Wherever there is a human being, there is an opportunity for kindness. And as always, I just hope that all of you are healthy and safe and making it through this very unusual time. And I will see you next time.